Nitro secrets revealed. Well, actually, there are no secrets. There's a lot of really obscure esoteric knowledge that goes along with running a fuel car, but there are no secret society with hand signs and stuff like that. Nitromethane is unique in that it's used in so few places and in such extreme applications that there are no formulas. There's no place, there's no videos you can watch, there's no books you can read, there's nothing. The only way you can really learn about how these things function is through cause and effect. Trial and error, cause and effect, and observation. Even the greatest minds in the history of drag racing and nitro racing, nobody went into it knowing what they were doing. It was all experimentation, trial and error, and then observation. And this is how these guys, the Dale Armstrongs and the Ken Vinis, and this is how these guys learned. Trial and error, the hard way. So it's been a week or so since we've touched the car, really. Dr. Art came and pulled some parts off the back of it, the clutch can and the rear end and all of that. And he's got videos on his channel showing that stuff. We're waiting, Jeff's been out of town for the last couple of weeks. We're waiting for parts to come in. So I figured this is a good opportunity to talk about Nitro itself. Where does the power come from? What are the operating characteristics of these engines? Because as I said before, if you follow this whole series, by the time you're done, you'll have enough knowledge to actually go out and operate one of these cars yourself. Don't do it. Don't do it, okay? But at least you'll have the knowledge if you wanted to do it. It's interesting at the very least. And like I said, it's very obscure, very misunderstood. So a couple of reasons, a couple of things that make this video particularly difficult to do is that there are so many different variables based on the type of vehicle that you're operating on Nitro. So in other words, like a funny car and a dragster have two different, they operate under two different circumstances, slightly different circumstances. So their tune is going to be slightly different. An altered is going to be different than either of those two. And this all has to do with the load-sensitive nature of Nitro and how different vehicles load the engine at different ways in different places along, during the course of a run. A hill climb vehicle burning nitro, like a motorcycle burning nitro, is going to be even, different from that. Blown versus unblown, different. Two strokes, different. But there are certain characteristics that are common to all nitro burning vehicles. But for our case, dealing with this nostalgia top fuel car, there's something that you need to be aware of as you follow along with the series. And that's that there's a before and after when it comes to nitro knowledge, all right? So there was a period of time of evolution that started right around 1985 and ended right around 1990, when everything that was thought to be true of nitro, the nature of nitro and how to make power with it, changed. Previous to that era, 1985 and earlier, and this is what we're dealing with here. This is 1970 technology or thereabouts. Nitro engines were run like every other type of race engine, meaning that the power was thought to be made and tuned and worked with from the top of the stroke down, okay? So like every other engine, gasoline, alcohol, and powerators like nitrous oxide and whatnot, the power is all made from top dead center until ballpark someplace before 90 degrees past, right? Or half stroke. And then around 60 degrees or thereabouts before bottom dead center, before the piston gets to the bottom of the stroke, the exhaust valve opens and what's called the blowdown cycle begins, where pressure is relieved from the cylinder. So up until around 1985 or so, nitromethane or nitro engines were tuned, set up, operated with that basic, under that basic fundamental, that the power is made from the top of the stroke to mid-stroke. Post 1985 into like the 1990 era, it was discovered that the power can actually be made at the bottom of the stroke as well. And that's the defining difference between nitromethane and every other type of fuel or power adder that you're going to come across. Nitromethane will take advantage of the full stroke, the full power stroke. Top dead center to bottom dead center, and it really doesn't care that the exhaust valve is open. Sounds crazy. And we're going to get into the bottom half of the stroke a little bit later on. But first we have to talk about some of these fundamentals. So, where does the power come from with nitro? What makes nitro special? Nitromethane releases its own oxygen supply as it burns. It's a monopropellant. So once you light it, it doesn't need atmosphere. It makes its own atmosphere. And that's why you can use as much of it in the combustion chamber as you can fit in there, or as much as you can spray in is as much as it will burn. So that sets it apart from other fuels. Nitrous oxide is similar in that the nitrous oxide introduces extra oxygen into the combustion chamber and allows you to burn more fuel. But nitrous oxide doesn't have the ability to extend past that 90 degrees past top dead center into the bottom part of the power stroke, into the blowdown cycle. So while nitrous oxide is similar, it can't ever pack the same punch as nitromethane does. All right. So it releases oxygen as it burns. Now here's an important aspect, an important element to this that really needs to be understood before you can understand how nitro engines work and how you would tune a nitro engine. And that's that nitromethane is load sensitive, meaning that the more resistance there is to its combustion, the greater its combustion. So here's an example. Here's an example of something relatable, okay? Firecrackers. You have two firecrackers. You're going to make two firecrackers. You have the same paper, newspaper that you wrap it up in, and the same amount of gunpowder in each one. Now, one firecracker, you roll it really, really tight, okay? And then the other firecracker, you just kind of roll it a little loose. So what happens? When you light the one that's wrapped tightly, it explodes, right? When you light the one that's loosely wrapped, it goes poof and then fizzles. Nitromethane operates the same exact way. Nitro goes into the combustion chamber, and that flame front has to be forced through the liquid. All right, now this is an important aspect of nitromethane. It has about the same ballpark specific gravity as water. It acts like water. And when it enters the combustion chamber, it's entering as, let's say, 80 or 90% water and like 10% steam. And it's the steam that is easily lit by the spark plugs. But now that flame front has to force its way through the liquid and ignite the liquid. Okay? The monopropellant part of it now takes over. The more that burns, the more oxygen is released, the more is able to be burned. But in the meantime, it needs that pressure, it needs the resistance so that the flame front can fight its way through the liquid. Okay. Now, an example you can see anytime you watch drag racing, let's say you watch a nitro cars run, and you'll see them do a burnout. So they'll start the engine, okay, and you'll see that all 8 pipes are popping, okay, and now they go in, they roll into the water, and they start the burnout. And all of a sudden, you see that 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 cylinders will just blow fuel, right? They're not functioning. They're just dumping raw fuel into the air, and only 3 or 4 cylinders are actually burning, right? They're actually burning the fuel. And that's because there isn't enough load while the thing is doing a burnout, while it's freewheeling, there isn't enough load to keep all 8 cylinders happy. So just a tiny amount of fuel is lit by the spark plug, but there's no resistance. There isn't enough resistance for that flame front to fight its way through the liquid on all 8 cylinders. So it'll drop as many cylinders as it needs to meet the load that it's seeing. Now you take that same dragster that dropped all those cylinders on a burnout, now it backs up to the starting line, all 8 cylinders are running, you hit the gas and on the throttle, and now you got 8 candles lit, because now there's a load. It's stuck to the track, the clutch has come in, and it's got the resistance. The flame front has the resistance that it needs to fight its way through the liquid, ignite the liquid, and make power. Right? Does that make any sense? I hope that made sense. All right. So it's releasing its own oxygen as it burns. It requires resistance to burn. And now another thing you need to understand about nitro is that it requires a thermal barrier around the parts of the combustion chamber. So a portion of that fuel has to remain unburned. That's why you've got to put so much volume in one of these. And that's why you get the header flames, tall header flames come out. Because a portion of the fuel that's introduced to the combustion chamber has to remain liquid, and it remains liquid as a thermal barrier around the cylinder walls, the combustion chamber, the spark plugs, the valves. There has to be that thermal barrier, or it'll act like a torch. And you've all seen pistons that get torched, and cylinder heads that are torched, and spark plugs that come out, all the end of it vaporized. It's because there wasn't enough liquid barrier in there, or liquid thermal barrier, to keep those parts happy. And this is important to know, because I'm going to talk about rod ratio, piston speed rod ratio, and how I determine some of this stuff on my own. It's important to understand that when a nitro engine is operated properly, when the tune-up is right for whatever given application, when you tear it apart after a run, you take the heads off, and you're going to see that everything is wet, right? You know that the engine was running right because you'll see that the chamber is wet. The top of the piston is wet with fuel still. That thermal barrier was there and it did its job. I guess it's important to know about is a little bit later on. All right, so excess fuel is for cooling. I actually made some notes for myself. I never make notes. I usually do these things off the top of my head. And I've already screwed up the notes because now I see talk about it being load sensitive. And, okay, all right. So let's throw the notes away. All right, now, we talked about how nitromethane will take full advantage of the full power stroke, even into the blowdown cycle when the exhaust valve was open. And like I said, this wasn't known about previous like 1985 or so. It was actually Dale Armstrong experimenting with Kenny Bernstein's combination that stumbled across this by blowing more and more fuel through the engine. That's where the second fuel pump and the second magneto came from. By blowing more and more fuel through the engine, they were making more and more power because that extra volume of fuel was allowing the flame front, or the active pressure pulse, to extend all the way to the bottom of the stroke. And that's the period of time where these engines went from making 2,000 horsepower, 2,500 horsepower, just operating from top dead center to around 90 degrees past, to where they started making 6,000, 8,000, and now 10,000 horsepower and above, because now they're using the full extent of the stroke. So now we get into rod ratio. Now you want to talk about really esoteric knowledge. I'm going to hit you with the most esoteric of all, because like I said, you cannot find this stuff in any textbook. There's no video you can watch. There's nobody's brain you could pick. When you enter into the world of screwing around with nitro engines, you're on your own. And you have to determine things through trial and error, cause and effect, and unfortunately reading damage, because that's how you learn with these things. You read the damage, you observe the damage, and then you figure out what happened. So I want to talk about the combination that we're going to run in this. But before you really understand the combination, you have to understand the importance of rod ratio. Now, rod ratio is simply dividing the length of the rod by the stroke of the crank, and that'll give you what's called the rod ratio. In a nitro motor, this becomes extremely important, but critical, okay? If you're thinking in terms of a gasoline engine, alcohol engine, nitrous, whatever, you think the important ratio is bore versus stroke. But when it comes to nitromethane, right, it doesn't really care about bore or stroke. It cares about rod ratio. And the reason for that is because the rod ratio dictates the acceleration rate and the deceleration rate. Very important, because remember now, nitro is operating at the bottom of the stroke. It's making power at the bottom of the stroke. So the deceleration rate of the piston becomes crucial. It becomes a crucial element. Because The quicker the piston decelerates on its way to zero, remember, okay, so piston is always at zero, its speed is zero at top dead center, its maximum at 90 degrees past, that's as fast as it's going to go, and then it reaches a dead stop again at the bottom of the stroke. The rod ratio dictates how quickly it accelerates from top dead center to 90, and then how quickly it decelerates from 90 to zero. Now remember, nitromethane requires load or resistance to burn efficiently. And the quicker you slow down, or the greater the deceleration rate past 90, dictates how much resistance there is, because as the piston is slowing down, the flame front is chasing it to the bottom of the stroke. The exhaust valve is open, but the volume of fuel that's in there is still working the piston downward, even though that exhaust valve is open during the blowdown cycle. So this is what I determined by working with several different combinations in several different cars, and just using observation based on damage. All right, so this is all based on a 426. All the numbers I'm going to give you now are based on a 426 Hemi, because that's what I ran predominantly. I screw around with early Chryslers every once in a while when the opportunity would pop up, but 90% of my experience with nitromethane was with 426 engines and their basic architecture. So here's what I learned, okay, by working with several different combinations, all of them based on a connecting rod. The connecting rod was the only stable, the only non-variable, because each of these combinations I worked with used a 7-inch plus 40 connecting rod, 7.040, okay, 3/16 long, 3/16 of an inch longer than stock. A 7-inch plus 40 connecting rod. Compression height was, the difference in compression height based on the different strokes was all made up by pin placement, okay? So this is what we found. A standard stroke Chrysler, the 3.75 inch, 3 3/4 inch stroke crank with a 7-inch plus 40 rod gave you a 1.87 rod ratio. Now, that made really good flexible power and did not require a ton of fuel volume to be happy. Okay, now fuel volume meaning the fuel pumps you're using, the size of the pumps, the speed of the pumps, the size of the nozzles. The fuel engine at that rod ratio, 1.87, didn't require a lot of nitro, and it was very, very happy. You could run them lap after lap after lap. They'd make good power and not hurt themselves. Flexible. Then you had the half-inch stroke, the 484. Okay. Now the half-inch stroke had a 1.65 rod ratio. So you take 4 1/4, you take 7.040 and you divide it by 4.25, which is a half-inch stroke for a 426, and you end up with a rod ratio of 1.65. 1.65. Now, there was a tremendous power difference between standard stroke and half-inch, but there was also a tremendous increase in the amount of fuel that was necessary to keep the engine happy, meaning that not only was there enough fuel in there to make the power to be burned, but also to leave a thermal barrier behind, so that when you do pull the heads off, you're seeing combustion chamber and the top of the cylinder head, the top of the piston and the combustion chamber and everything that wet with fuel, the thermal barrier intact. It took an exponential amount of fuel from the standard stroke to the half-inch to keep it happy. But still, the half-inch was a very flexible, and they made in that period of time, the late 1980s, early 1990s, making probably 3,000 or so horsepower out of the 484. Super flexible, super happy. You could match race those things all day long, and really just change the oil and the plugs and set the valves between rounds, and you're good to go. Now you get into the 5/8 stroke. So the 5/8 stroke was the killer combination going into around 1990. 5/8 stroke gave you 496 cubic inches with the 4¼ bore. Now with the 5/8 stroke, you have a 1.6 rod ratio. Now at that point, because of the 1.6 rod ratio, the deceleration rate, the acceleration rate from top dead center to mid, and then the deceleration from mid to bottom becomes greater. Now remember, the quicker the deceleration, the more resistance the flame front has against the head of the piston, which causes it to burn more fuel. So now if you took, there's only a handful of cubic inches, 484 cubic inches for the 1/2 inch stroke, and 496 for the 5/8 stroke. It's just a handful of cubic inches. But the fuel requirement to keep a 5/8 stroke happy was exponentially greater than a 1/2 inch. You had to run big pumps overdriven with big nozzles to keep that thermal barrier intact and not have any detonation issues, or not have any torching issues, I should say. 5/8 made a lot of power. Part of the reason it made that power was that deceleration rate at the bottom of the stroke, creating that extra resistance, the extra load that would eat more of the fuel volume. Then we came to the 3/4 inch stroke crank, which is what they use today. So on the 3/4 inch stroke crank, to keep the engines under 500 cubic inches, the bore was decreased from 4¼ to 4.187, okay? And then to round it off to 500 cubic inches, well, that's what you have. It was like 498 or 499 cubic inches. That's the 4.5 inch stroke crank, 3/4 inch stroke crank, and a 4.187 bore. And that was the standard combination from 1990 or thereabouts, until I think they're still using that today, but I don't know. I have no idea what they do today. So here's what I found. The rod ratio, remember again, keeping the 7.040 rod, the rod ratio dropped to 1.56. And at 1.56, what I found was you had detonation at the bottom of the stroke. The deceleration rate. So here's what would happen. You take the same basic combination that you ran at 5/8, okay? The cubic inches are the same. You take the same basic combination you ran at 5/8, and now you go to 3/4. And you'll take the cylinder heads off, and you're going to find that the top of the piston is wet. The combustion chamber is wet. There's no signs of obvious heat, but you'll find the ring lands beat out of the piston's broken. You'll find all sorts of crazy friggin' damage, but no signs of detonation. Were no signs of heat detonation like you would find at the top of the stroke. So where you would find the spark plug showing heat or evaporated, you'd find the combustion chamber torched, you'd find the head of the piston dry and showing signs of extreme heat. At the 3/4 inch stroke, you would find none of those things. There was enough volume in there to keep the thermal barrier intact, but not enough volume to fight the slowing down of the piston, the accelerated, or I should say the greater deceleration rate of the piston at the bottom of the stroke. Well, there wasn't enough fuel volume there to keep it happy, so it would detonate at the bottom of the stroke. You ended up with cold detonation. And the only difference was going from 1.6 of the 5/8 stroke to 1.56 of the 3/4 stroke. That was it. It was just that little bit of greater deceleration rate at the bottom of the stroke that made the difference. And at that point, there was an exponential amount of fuel necessary. That's when they went to the super big pumps, the 44 amp mags. Crazy things to light the volume of fuel necessary to keep the engine happy at the bottom of the stroke. So here's one of the things that happened during this period of time, because I was working with a top fuel car consistently at the time. Actually, I was partners on the car. We went to the 3/4 inch stroke crank and the smaller bore, the 4.187 bore, but we kept the camshaft. That was we tried using the camshaft that we used with the 5/8 stroke, okay, and destroyed everything, beat the living piss out of the pistons, broke everything, total destruction, but no signs of heat. No signs of heat. It was very perplexing. So then we found out that there was a new camshaft profile, a new camshaft grind being used, and I don't remember the specifics of it, that was being used by the big guys. So we ordered one of these cams, put it in the car, made no changes other than putting the cam in the car. And now there was no detonation, no problems, no nothing, but no power either. The car would barely do a burnout. It would just squeak itself off the starting line. It was horrible, because in order to compensate for that deceleration rate with the longer stroke, the cam grinders started opening the valve sooner. So instead of opening at, let's say, 60 degrees before bottom dead center, they were starting to open it just after 90, just after half stroke. They started to creep the exhaust valve open and then jammed it open all at once. The exhaust ramp was very critical. Sorry about that. The battery went dead. Where was I? So we were talking about the camshaft and how we put the new grind cam in the car and it made no power at all, because we weren't able to feed it enough volume and light it with the mags and the pumps that we had. So the solution was to go back to the same cam that we used with the 5/8 and the half-inch stroke. We went back to that cam and then just advanced it, I believe it was 6 degrees. And that got the valve open quickly enough, the exhaust valve open quickly enough to evacuate before that abrupt stop at the bottom of the stroke. So what I determined at that point was that 1.56 is the critical ratio. 1.6 was safe, right? Every place from 187 to 116, all those different combinations were safe and happy, and they made power. And then once you crossed that line and got into the 1.56, that was the critical mark. Once you hit 1.56 in the rod ratio, that deceleration rate at the bottom of the stroke clashed with the pressure pulse, and boom, bottom hole detonation with no signs of heat. Boy, was that perplexing. I mean, you want to talk about pulling your hair out. Because remember, this was all brand new at the time. There's no books you can read. There's just nobody's going to fill these blanks for you. They don't know, because they're all learning themselves as they go along. So that was it was a difficult and painful learning curve, but we learned. And like I said, 1.56 always stuck in my mind as the critical point. Once you reach 1.56, the nature of the engine changes completely. And that was the step in evolution, where they went from making 2,500, 3,000 horsepower to 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, whatever the hell they make today. It's ridiculous. But all of that developed during that period of time of evolution. So, I don't know if anything I said made any sense to anybody listening. It's like a memory dump. It's like a memory dump. But I think that would give you the basic idea of the nature of what you're dealing with in terms of burning nitro. So, without, at the risk of this video going like way longer than I wanted it to, and it probably already has, let's just bring you up to speed on the combination that we have here, okay? So, on those 426 engines, we were running the pistons approximately 180 out to achieve a static compression ratio of around 6.5 to 1. So this engine here, we're dealing with pistons that are 110 down the hole. It has a much smaller combustion chamber. The early Chrysler has a smaller combustion chamber than the 426. So instead of the piston being 180 out, we want it between like 110, 140, 150 down the hole to achieve that same static compression ratio. Remember, the dynamic compression ratio is completely different, because you got a supercharger and you have all this liquid volume of fuel taking place, taking up space in the combustion chamber. That increases the dynamic compression ratio greatly. But static compression ratio, we're 110 down the hole. We have a 6.5-inch connecting rod, all right, and we have a 3.65 stroke crank. So remember, the rod ratio that dictates the action of the cylinder piston at the bottom of the stroke. We have a 1.79 rod ratio. So going back to our experience with the 426, that 1.79 rod ratio means that this engine is going to operate the same basic characteristic as the 426 with either the stock stroke or the half-inch stroke crank. So stock stroke was 1.87 with that 7-inch 40 connecting rod was 1.87, and the half-inch was 1.65. So this engine is going to be right there in that range. It'll be happy. We're not going to have to throw a huge amount of fuel at it. We're not going to have to light it with a big friggin' magneto. It'll make good power. It'll make good flexible power and won't hurt itself with that basic combination. But it certainly won't make, let's say, the same power as a contemporary nostalgia top fuel car would, because they do use bigger pumps, bigger magnetos. They're lighting, they're working past that 90 degrees, where, you know, where let's say a conventional nitro car would run. We're not going that far. We're using all pre-1985. That the pre-evolution is where we're at with this thing, and that combination should be very happy. We've got a 4-inch. I wrote this down here. We have a 4-inch plus 2 5-inch bore, right? So just over 4-inch bore, and we end up with 369 cubic inches. And the cubic inches is really secondary to all of these other relationships. At least that's what I found during my time screwing around with these things back in the day. Cubic inch is really almost irrelevant. It's these other relationships, your static compression ratio and rod ratio and exhaust valve opening point on the camshaft. So with that rod ratio where it is on this engine, I don't have to worry about where we're opening the exhaust valve. There is some benefit. You can tune through exhaust valve flash, and it is critical, believe it or not. You know, you can actually see a difference, a tuning difference in the exhaust valve flash on these engines. So the grind on this cam, I have not determined the grind yet. I will before you see the next installment of this. I'll know exactly what we have there, and then I'll determine where we're going to set it as far as a straight up, advanced, or retarded. It'll probably just end up going, if it's the cam and I think it is, straight up is going to be just fine. So, all right, basics of how nitromethane works. Nitro secrets. Only there's no secrets. There's just a lot of really bizarre esoteric knowledge that really nobody should have. Nobody should have this in their head because it takes up too much space and it doesn't allow you to function as like a regular person doing like regular things, because this shit is jammed in your brain and it won't go away. Keep your pistons, keep the top of your pistons wet. Important. Keep the top of the pistons wet. I'll see you tomorrow.